What then? Are we any better off, he says, to Jews? Not at all, for we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under the power of sin. As it is written, there is no one who is righteous, not even one. All right, so this is what Paul has done. He's constructed this really ugly picture about people that you don't want to have anything to do with. And then he says, if you were with me in the boat, pointing your finger at those people that you don't want to have anything to do with, I'm going to point my finger at you, right? Because we are all under this same power. We are all under this same power of sin. None of us is out of this boat. We all live in this same boat that you were just kind of lifting your nose at. And then he sums it all up in chapter 3, verse 22. For there is no distinction. Lutherans know this text, right? But we forget that it applies to all 3 chapters. There is no distinction. Since all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, they are now justified by God's grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Jesus Christ. So do you understand the trap? And we fall for it every time we take up this text to point our finger at those poor homosexuals who we want to exclude from church and society because they are unclean, or because they have HIV, or because they're yucky, or because they have sinned. We fall for Paul's trap, because the point that Paul is making is that once you start pointing those fingers, you have already made a distinction. And there is no distinction. All have fallen short, all are in the same boat, and we are all saved by God's grace. And that is the only argument for Paul that's going to get Jewish, law-abiding, righteous Israelites to be in the same community with Gentile, uncircumcised, unclean believers. Right? And he finds the key to this argument in what happened to Abraham. And this brings us all the way back to the beginning. Remember what happened to Abraham? To Abraham was made the promise, right? God made the promise of circumcision. If you and your ancestors are circumcised, you will be my children forever. And circumcision was always the sign of that promise. And Paul goes back and says, God made the promise because of Abraham's faith. So Gentiles can be included without circumcision. The clean and the unclean can be together in one community. All of those who were in that boat are in the same boat, and there is no distinction. We are all saved through faith in Jesus Christ. So, is that helpful in looking at this text? Is that a helpful little excursion? It is really impossible to do what these 2 interpreters did. And it's what most people, when they read this text, do. That's to kind of limit the reading to a couple of verses that say men having sex with men and women having sex with women. People try to do a lot of things with those little verses. Some people say that's not really what Paul's talking about. Well, Paul is talking about that. He's talking about men having sex with men and women having sex with women. That's what is... But he's not talking about it in the way we want him to talk about, which our prejudice, our bias, requires us to have him talk about it. He's talking about it in a different way. He's trying to make the point that this community is a community where we're going to be with people whose hands we don't want to shake. And we got to get over it. All right, so I've talked for a really long time. It's 10:32. I think we have a couple of minutes before the next service starts. So let's just open it up for some questions. This may not have been persuasive to people. If it's not, feel free to speak about that. If you heard something new or something liberating, feel free to speak about that. If you just have a question, feel free to speak about that. I'm not a Greek scholar, so I'm relying really heavily on Countryman for his work in the Greek. So those kinds of questions are a little harder for me. But yes.
Can you help me understand? Is what you're saying is homosexuality is sin, but it's something that we should accept along with the other sins? Agreeing pretty much with Joel.
Correct. That's not what I'm saying. Countryman is saying that Paul does not make the equation homosexuality equals sin. He says that homosexuality equals uncleanness. Uncleanness, which is different from sin. The sin is idolatry.
I get that.
Yeah, but that's an important thing because we collapse uncleanness and sin. And Countryman would say, if you talk to righteous Jews, not all uncleanness is sin. Uncleanness and sin are different categories. They're different ways of looking at the world, and you can't just make them, you can't make them one. So what Joel did was he made homosexuality and sin equivalent alongside murders and strife, and then it's easier for us to require some kind of change.
So we have to start thinking of homosexuality as in a whole different category.
A whole different category. We have to, Paul thought of homosexuality. We think maybe of homosexuality completely different than Paul did, right? We understand that people are by nature homosexual. It's not just, and by nature we mean something differently. It's not just a custom. It's not a fad. It's not, I woke up one day and I decided I was going to try to have sex with a man today, and that's not what we think of when we think of homosexuality. We know that that people discover that this is the way they are, right? But they discover that in the middle of a world, in the midst of a world that's captivated by this bias, by this prejudice, which causes us to read the text in a certain way, and to make the text say things that may not be there. And one of those things is that homosexuality equals sin may not be in this text. And if it's not in this text, I don't see it in this text, it's about uncleanness, then perhaps we should back off that so that we're releasing people from their burden, right? It's easier if you grow up gay and you're not being told all the time, you are a sinner just because of who you are. Not in the way Lutherans usually say it, but you're in a special category of sinfulness, like you're an alcoholic or whatever, right? Like you're a murderer. Well, no, I've just discovered this. So Paul is inviting us to think of it more, maybe like we don't want to have anything to do with those people, right? They're yucky. We would never allow that in our community. And Paul is saying, if you think that way, think again, because there is no distinction.
Thank you.
Is that helpful?
Yes, okay.
Thoughts, comments, other things? Yes?
I think it's helpful when, in that conversation, you put it alongside the uncircumcised and think about those two as more equated with each other than how we think of it. Because uncircumcision, I don't know what, like in that community was like zero, with bats and everything and they knew. I'm trying to say a whole bunch of things in a small amount of time.
No, I think that's really true. I think putting it alongside uncircumcision puts it into the unclean category.
Right.
But we wouldn't say about uncircumcised people, you're a special kind of sinner. We don't even think that way about them. But we've been taught to think that way about gay and lesbian people. That they're a special kind of sinner. And we don't hate them, we hate the sin. You know?
It's difficult to argue with someone who believes that a homosexual person makes that choice. It's, to a lot of people, the thought is not nature, it's a choice.
Correct.
And I have difficulty arguing with that person.
And I think that the choice argument derives from the more fundamental understanding that God could not have possibly made people this way. It is inconceivable that these people are a part of the created order because they are sinful, right? Because it is a sin. So if your argument shifts and you recognize that God has created a grand diversity, we don't understand most of it, but gay and lesbian people are created this way, they don't choose it. You don't have to construct an argument around choice. In the same way that most gay and lesbian people, they don't choose, they discover. Right? They come to an awareness that they are gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender. And then they have to figure out how to live with it, what to make it, how to tell family.
And I would say, unfortunately, our media is just making things even more muddy because they, have situations where somebody just decides, well, this relationship didn't work out, and so I think I'm gonna be gay. I mean, it just, that's where I think that the choice argument comes in, and, now is that sin? Is that going against the nature? I mean, do people really, anyway, I think
Yeah.
it just adds to the
muddledness.
The sinful argument.
Yeah. And the sinful argument mostly in our culture all comes from this text. The other texts gather around to support it, but Paul really lays it out here. And Countryman is saying, well, let's take it apart a little bit. And you can see that Paul is talking about the sin of idolatry and this other list of sins. But because of this sin of idolatry, people are being given over to this lifestyle that we find unbecoming. Something that we really don't want to have any. And he's doing this in service of trying to get everybody in that finger-pointing boat. Right? He wants everyone to be sitting there going, ugh, ugh. And then he can turn on you and say, aha, I got you. Because there is no distinction.
I would like you to comment on the whole problem of Christians interpreting the Bible.
No. Really?
We say, how can they possibly come up with a conclusion as such of whatever you're discussing? And your example of having to take 3 chapters to answer a question, we're doing something wrong in teaching our Bible.
Yeah, that's true. Here, instead of my commenting, let me quote Krister Stendhal, because he says this about interpretation. These days, the new resources of ore and mineral riches on the great continent of Australia are spotted not by teams with Geiger counters, but by satellites. One has to get quite a distance in order to see them. There is a way in which we also need some distance when we read the Bible. We have to stay with it until it opens up what it is, not what it becomes by our cleverness. So do you see what he's saying? We have to back up, right? So sometimes we take the Romans text and we go, Romans 16, it's so clear here. And he's saying, well, what's the context? What's he trying to say? Let's back up. And then it becomes bigger. We understand the struggle that he's finding himself in. We understand his major point. And not what it becomes by our own cleverness. I love that one too. We make the Bible say all different kinds of things that were never intended, but we have to allow it to speak a new word. And if Romans is supposed to speak only a word to the sinful gay and lesbian people, it's pretty easy to make it say that. But if it's supposed to speak a word to all of us, and it's that you are in the same boat because God is saving all of us, then it's a word for all of us. It's a life-giving, liberating word for the whole Christian community. It makes the book come alive again, not just as a book to punish a small class of people, but a book for all of us to reclaim our inheritance, the inheritance of Abraham. One more question, and then I think we have to do.
If the Supreme Court overturns Proposition 8, where does the Christian religion stand? Where's Lutherans going to stand on this point?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's kind of the question that's right in front of us, right? A lot of Christians are going to stand with the folks that we saw here. But I think this could provide a unique and an interesting opportunity for Lutherans, who have always valued the public sharing of promises. We've called that marriage whenever we've seen it. We recognize it when we see it. And perhaps it's not necessary for us to recognize that only among a certain class of people, right? We can recognize the sharing of promises between gay men and between lesbian women and between straight couples in the same way and celebrate that in our communities. So we could do that now.